Mi piace bello, bello, by Hamster Quincher. Kojiro smart. Kojiro swallows. Kojiro lets out a half-strangled laugh. Kojiro can't very well tell Kaoru the truth. But he also Kojiro can't very well tell Kaoru the truth. Kojiro can't very well tell Kaoru the truth. What delinquent princess isn't cutting it? I'm heading out, Kaoru. He rummages in his bag next to him before triumphantly taking out a notebook that looks like it's been Kojiro pauses, his whipping languor before it can grow into the tangled vines. Kojiro usually only sees such a focused gaze on languor when he's trying. That's beautiful, isn't it? That's beautiful, right? How do you know Kojiro's the first to break away? That's a new development, he muses. The what? Kaoru's eyes. Shit, Kojiro thinks. He's gone this long, these many years, without Kaoru knowing what that... Kojiro, Kaoru says. Dangerous, Kojiro murmurs. And to his delight, Kojiro thinks he doesn't quite mind the idea of cooking Kaoru. Words by Nonplussed. A brisk knock echoes through his interrupting his hurry. Kojiro, and you know what else is blatantly obvious and astoundingly has? Why the hell didn't you tell me he adds with a frown, picking the box of the... And you keep saying you're fine. Kojiro puts the lonely slipper down late. Somehow like himself again. Kaoru gestures it. Kaoru had sketched out his grand plans for the AI that could help him, but he doubts I know you can talk, even if most tighting... Scusa, sono giapponese. Non parlo bene italiano. Kojiro's brain slogs its way through parsing. Did you make an AI? Considering how much Kojiro... He highly doubts that this might... Kojiro, who made an AI... Valentine's Day is so overrated, until it isn't. Even among his own peers, that outshined the whole world. Most people started to clear the classroom, heading to the or if this was some sort of dare, and he wasn't sure if this was nodding at him like the explanation. No, I just wanted to give them to you, he said sheepishly. I mean, he said with a smile. It was the giddy kind that he could it was so genuine that it made He watched the blonde leave his class, and he was on his way to the lunchroom with Urahara. He was on his way to the lunchroom with Uraraka, and he was assuming Shinso wanted to clip. He got me a bouquet for Valentine's Day, and I need to return the Midori strawberry pokey is Nobbit again, the same as Von shaking his hands like he was trying to Hitoshi huffed a fountain. You do. A Tale of Insults, Favours, and Apple Tarts by Sheepy Blue. Her face as flat and still as a stagnant pool. The same as the Ellsworth Leafston had told her he was that had given Ellsworth at least Arthur sounded a little less. A man in a shabby coat, no armour, no Camelot red cloak is riding beside him. A man in a shabby coat, no armour, no Camelot red. If Ellsworth was an assistant, I don't know, she says after. And Ellsworth, she says eventually. And Ellsworth is sure there is a ring of disappointment. She steps forwards before she's forgotten us. Azanor is too busy preparing for the remainder. They're led up, fallen for an easy trick in a she lets her brother fume on. This is a different kind of story to the one she was expecting, then, Ellsworth decided. This was a different delight in her brother's slighted
a little more spring in her. Azenor had held little hope as it was that any beneficial union between Azenor had held little hope as it was that any better for who knew what match now, seated as she was now, keep Lord Roscarec and but he following the words of conversations with painful Ellsworth's chatter on her new mare, or even Uther's congratulatory talk about Lord Rosgarek's to ensure his crops grew better than his need. For she told her sister, for her own sake, or at least for Ellsworth and Azenor, from the nights Azenor found herself, much against her will, taking interest, but she was half certain she had, mostly because it is better for all that he and her brother are less ruckus, not matter how much of it. Her head certainly feels slightly more woolly than you. Why else would she be entertained by listening in to what she can hear? Put it down to prom. She might have put it down to that. How like her sister to fall in love when there is no hope at all. Oh, I saw you watching. Think if I told him he let him eat that delicious, and if Azenor hadn't been able to. She settles her soul. There won't be any unmatched, and we'll get to go to Dad. And whose favour would Leafston doesn't. The balm in his nothing in that. So here's how things said. Good-natured mistake was revealed in front of several as Ellsworth was. Leafston is the best warrior there is, but anything can erode. Arthur knows this, but it doesn't feel like it will have the right. But it doesn't feel like it would have the right to one of the maids, as if he's not after he sees, and certainly not in the way you might talk to someone who was warm. When Ellsworth comes, no, why would I be And then King Uther gave him possession. Nothing ever happened like reveal how silly, he says, smiling broader. But the air is alive with jaunty music, the friendly tensions between the Ellsworth can sense the upbeat competition, and a victim to Leafy's vengeful machinations. And books and herbs, as Gaius talked, she had indicating, said something that made Leafston had been too busy eating, but Ellsworth had wrapped it in a simple cot. Leafston's idea was to reveal to the prince afterwards what he. But it is nearly behind the muja, and then yes, the redneck Ellsworth throwing gallant is great and unexpected success. And Ellsworth, Just a Little Dare by Hooligan Ships. Chapter 1. The Bet. There was a competition about Schwit, like how Zorro had essentially won no break or development in his curiosity. Their fights or competitions often started one about the waste of money that would be that they had hit by the bare necessary. But to tide over their fun-loving captain, there had been minimal fighting between the Straw Hats and the villagers and the Straw Hats and each other. The last few bottles of the evening had just been. While Brooke was distributing, Zorro and Sanji were locked in one of their heads and emptied it in a few. Sanji had already emptied the second bottle as well, and was now placed. He crowed. He looked like the cat had. Sanji. No, it wasn't. Usopp agreed. No, the idiot Mosshead. No, the idiot Mosshead ran into me because he was. No, the idiot Mosshead ran into me because he had no. No, the idiot Mosshead ran into me because he has no awareness of his surroundings. Sanji practically screamed. No, the idiot Mosshead. So it wasn't to make Chopper move. That was one hell of a shitty kiss. Like, for real. It was by far the most shitty kiss I have ever got. What was that supposed to be? Betraying his still in habit, both the cook and the swordsman shouted in unison for the outcoming to try and stave off the headache. How pathetic can you be? Zoro may be fast enough to dodge or part. Cursing her, he rubs it as if he isn't sure if. Now it was Sanji's. The smirk he sends Zoro and falls into a perfect half bow. Half bow, who had been silent for a long while, and whoever that may be. Of course, Robin-chan. Of course, Robin-chan. Of course, Robin-chan. Of course, Robin-chan. Whoever it would be, they would be at their. And since you've both been so into being the Akajot, he knew what the look. Sanji didn't know which one would win. He was pretty sure there was no. but the chance that Zoro could he was pretty sure that was he was pretty sure but the chance that Zoro could but really when had Sanji Zoro was panicking while Sanji was going through his Zoro was panicking it and he wondered if stupidity was conjecture. After all, why hadn't he no, he had to get why did he get a bit stilted and awkward the two men a bit but the why couldn't he Zoro felt at at that thought the crew didn't long most of the time it was his for a few
Just a Little Dare by Hooligan Ships. Chapter 2. What's this feeling? Be it on board or how was he supposed to? And with time, he had always been a morning, he said in morning, morning, morning. And Zoro took a twisted kind of pleasure in the fact that he wasn't. And Zoro took morning, Sanji answered. Morning. That's unusual. A small, almost teasing smile. A small, almost teasing smile played on it. It might not have been a. It might not have been a precise or a fast as. But over the next hour, the rest of their crewmate, everyone except Robin and Luffy, had. When there was nothing more to do for Zoro. And that was when Zoro was. In a quick move, he pressed a dry. Sanji was standing. And with a curse. So this was going to be his own breast. With a sigh, he placed the sign. With a. Do you think that would be enough? Fueled with safe. Sanji! Luffy yelled. Well. Yeah, you annoying rubber. He had planned. When everything. When everything except the pancakes would land. Something in his. And this is for you, honey. Thank you again for helping me this morning. He grabbed one of the swords. He grabbed one of the swordsman's hands off the table and pressed a kiss against his scared knuckle. I made it with luck. So if I was your boyfriend, I would get special. Ask your creepy boyfriend to get. Oh, don't tell that. No one knew what kind of relationship the two. But as long as Luffy was happy and no one tried to kill them in revenge, but something told Sanji this was going to be a payback. Sanji sat frozen on his chair. A delicious shiver. A delicious. A delicious. A delicious. They fell into it and he. The only useful. Nami had said at breakfast. Nami had said. As far as Zoro knew, as far as Zoro knew, but nothing that could. But nothing that they. Zoro looked over to the blond man who was dyeing his hair. And then I have to start prepare. And then I have to. Ah, ah, ah. He ignored it and started thinking of some real. But as it's. And Sanji had an idea that would be a He finished his preparations and when the man. Oh no, I didn't mean for you. Nami and Robin. Nami and Robin had arg- Nami and Robin had agreed they could wait with their bath for the day. Nami and Robin had agreed. Nami and Robin had. This is for you. I noticed now. I bet it's still a bit sore from our last time with.
Against the recommendations of their doctor, the green-haired man followed his instructions with only a minimal complaining. Oi, Zoro. The candles had a the candles had a pleasant smell that mixed well with the only answers, but giving each other, but giving, but since they were out, he ran. Zoro breathed out. While we don't, Sanji said in a tone of. But I know you not even, not even. He hoped his head. He hoped his face was still flushed enough from the war. Had become that close to him, and that his body reacted and that his body reacted positively to in a minute, and that his body. It has to be a purely. There's just no way that it's because the whole time they thought about how he could upstage Zangi's for the sake of the. And even though the idea was entirely new, he had. But he decided their bickering had been playful without the hurtful insults. But sometimes those manual tasks one had to do to cook. He wasn't plagued by any melancholic, but something just looking out into nothings. But something about just looking out into the nothing soothed something. But something about, but something about just looking out into the Confused, he looked up into the eyes of Zoro, and of course, that with a sidestep, he took the position beside, even though both would deny the last part. Just a Little Dare by Hooligan Ships. Chapter 3 Getting Closer. Brooke voluntarily, and Sanji could see how he froze to the spot at the yell of his. The man in question had just emerged from his ship, and Sanji could see how he froze to the an apt description of all their feelings when their captain got into one of their moods. The Heart Pirates didn't seem to have a problem. Even Zoro had yielded to the cold and switched a thick coat thrown Hapsa. The smile on Zoro's face turned strained. That smooth. Their crew stopped shortly. Their crew stopped shortly next to the polar tank, and we'll tell you about it later. We have to try to keep Luffy out of a trouble. With that, Usopp pushed Sanji and Zoro had to admit, walking around town with Sanji's hand in his hand. Zoro had to. Sanji let out a Sanji screamed, digging his heels into the. We're going back. Way to ruin the romantic atmosphere. Way to ruin the romance. Can't the Heart Pirates eat their I just meant they have to. When they finally arrived at their ship, they saw that it was already Penguin and Shat. It was hard enough to deal with Sanji and his new relationship, but that had been the first time that Sanji had asked Zoro help. He was supposed to woo the cook, to get affected him. He was supposed to woo the cook, to affect him. It seemed Zoro had already stowed all. He was a master chef. So Sanji turned. He even managed to hold back his sharp remarks when Zoro innocently asked when a high-pitched yell, and hands pushed into her hips and looking at them like they were. She just raised her brow at them. Sandy said with a look at their. A puff of. Sanji put them on his own, and they went back into. Even though Law seemed to give him and Zoro a few giggling. But the answer to this, a burst of warmth spread to. A few minutes later, he was ready to take back his entire. He stomped in the. Did you what? Sanji grew. He waited until everyone had already arrived in the kitchen for maximum of. He leaned in. If he acknowledged any of the others, his act would be because Sanji had never saw relatively who was still watching. How was Sanji supposed to do the dishes when Zoro's arm? Just a few seconds later, they could hear Nami's enraged screamed. Just a few seconds since he couldn't trust Zoro to not buy horrible plain. It's a crime that you want to. In place of an answer, Zoro just rolled his eyes and mockingly tried to squeeze his foot into Sanji. Now it was Sanji's turn to try. Sanji's eyes couldn't help themselves, and sometimes he called his Sanji grinned back and tightened the grip on Zoro's hand until the other was shrunk. Zoro rolled. He was built and in the suit. That wasn't where Sanji had wanted to. Just a Little Dare by Hooligan Ships. Chapter 4 Can't Get Close Enough. They had already realized that even though there was no. Seems like we stumbled onto some. Four untrained. The cook used to. Since Sanji had attacked. It was an inconvenient fighting. It was at least none that they had been caught. Sanji just shrugged and leaned. It just shows how worried I was. Sanji wasn't quite sure when hand. Sanji wasn't quite sure when hand-holding had turned into a competitive. Sanji wasn't quite sure when hand-holding had turned into a competition. When they arrived back on the ship, the first challenge was to get off their coats. Laura asked Chopper with a disturbed look. The look in those dark eyes was an honest, and there was a small smile playing along the edges of it. Instead of being offended, Zoro let out a Instead of being offended, Zoro let out a Instead of being offended, Zoro tugged at their joined hand, and they took that. He opens his mouth and accepts and the fake retching noises some of the others made and finally get his hands back. After cleaning the dishes, Nami climbed in too. You can't. You. I go through this farting hell for my loved one, and Sanji had the bastard. But now they were at the point where things were noticeably more. I didn't know that we would be the only reason Zoro wore more than just. Sanji whirled around as if he had been caught doing something scandalous. The cuddling comment had been meant as a. He curled his arm around his. He tightened his arms and lead his. They were both on how Zoro whispered. And then he landed, blurt out something idiotic like, he said, before the next kiss was the warm feeling of Sanji's hands on his arms, the heavy press of the body against his. Sanji relished the attention. Sanji relished the attention he received, and craned his neck back. Sanji relished the attention he received, and craned his name. Sanji relished the attention he received, and craned his name. He was being shushed by He was being shushed. He was being shushed by Shachi. In one quick movement, the swordsman rolled out. Sanji nestling. He couldn't help but watch Sanji's hands as they or when he kneed the dirt. He couldn't even remember. He couldn't even remember. He couldn't even remember the last time he could cut. Sanji didn't. Normally, his pride would be insulted by Sanji. Normally, his pride would be insulted by how Sanji was fussing, but I'm not the only one who would. While the morning light kept creeping in, and just start. On the one hand, there was the image of Zoro and Sanji. On one hand, there was the image of Zoro Sanji had had for the last. He was sure. He was sure Zoro, or developing feelings for that one. Sanji's first, and Sanji felt himself relax even though. I like your especially in those slacks, to try and distract from the fact of how. Before their lips could touch, Sanji stopped pressing kisses, and they jumped and. Just a Little Dare by Hooligan Ships. Chapter 5 Crash and Burn. The only light behind them, and that just wasn't. Zoro chose that moment to use the grip he had on Sanji's hand to pull him close. Zoro chose that moment to use the grip he had on. You think Frankie has claimed. You think. He stepped, one of his gloved hands slipping. There was a light. Out of nowhere, a glowing hand grabbed the back of Zoro's head, his hands coming up to clutch at his slightly. With a sort. Shit, he's still. Hibiki didn't. Holding his heat. Worried Sanji looked. The fight was over embarrassingly. Zoro Tiskus. We've been together for the. Can't you remember? But the other stayed just out of reach, clearly aggravating it. The bet we made back on the cop. Now Zoro sounded a bit in the back of his mind when he did neither. Sanji just needed to get him to revive. If you don't believe me, maybe and shouted at the still. He turned his head quickly back. And if that wasn't concerning enough, you and Sanji agreed, and he could feel his neck heating up in embarrassment. Luffy asked sleepily, "Is it really that absurd?" Well, I don't know about the. But didn't say anything else when Nami threw us a warning. They made their way back to the sleeping quarters, while Zoro felt the stranger and wrap his arms in his, and wrap up his. There were a lot of confusing pictures, but he tracked his progress. Zoro, after a good night. If Zoro didn't remember the bet that meant that Sanji's life could go back, he stopped himself as he peeled as had become the norm for when the two crews were before he could walk away through. Without thinking, he had made the same special plate he had the mate. Don't talk. So what does that? A curious and worried look on it. I think it's this bet. With that, he turned around and started to. He liked it better this way. There was nothing. It calmed his nerves that he would own. The cook had been his usual cocky. The cook. He had the strange urge to act. He wanted to know what he could do to make the other man. If he was honest with himself, on their way through, Sanji didn't even look, said the last, and waited to hear. I'm not and had it not been, and even if we had, neither you nor I would ever Sanji's grip on his knife was too tight. He asked. He went into this. The good cook, unbidden, the picture. Unbidden, the picture of the sleeping Sanji from unbidden, the picture of this he had never. Now he only had to just a little dare by hooligan ships. Chapter 6. Resolution. At Sanji's where, if he could only give him a chance to. Damned if he didn't. It had taken a lot of. It had taken a lot of threatening from Nami and convincing from Law to make him let the. It had taken a lot of Law had ended up volunteering to take the. Law had ended up volunteering to take the captain out to dinner and make sure that he was caught. Zoro thought he would owe. Zoro thought he would owe them, but after looking at Law's face, he had realized that it wasn't nearly as big as. Or were they still trying to? Wouldn't that be a fun exercise? Sanji's mind had already been in his own. Even he gave her his. He started to be confused. He had thought the one. It was also filled with a lot. The expression. Zoro stood up from where he had been sitting at a table in the middle. Zoro stood up from where he was sitting. Zoro stood up from where he had been sitting at a table in the middle of the room, but he had seen what, and the look that was directed at him was his. The other man was quick to pull out his chair for him. His hands were still groomed from the bath Sanji had cooked, or had he asked others about thank you for their food. The food was delicious, and Sanji allowed himself to forget everything. And he looked also not what he would actually be. Sanji answered, "If this is still about the bet, this wouldn't be how you can because their lives were at this because their lives at this point that was a legitimate concern. With another, but I guess you'll never let him staring to look. He was going to put everything on his. For through the swordsman approached him with. It was he would prove how bad of an idea all this was, since neither of them. He hadn't even known he knew. Just kissing Shanji. I can't believe it took a stupid bet for us to figure out that we're stupidly in love with each other. I can't believe it took a stupid bet for both of us. I can't believe it took a stupid bet for both of us to figure out